1. The Case of the Paul Family, 1958. The triple murder, the first such case in the history of the city of Vancouver, remains unsolved even now, even though 60 years have passed. On June 10th, an unknown madman entered the Paul family home. He brutally dealt with the head of the family, David Paul, beating and shooting him in the basement of his own home. David's 11-year-old daughter Dorothy was beaten to death in her bedroom by a maniac. Unfortunately, Helen Paul, David's wife and Dorothy's mother, returned home from work at that time. The killer shot her in the face. The maniac left a bloody print on the wall of the children's bedroom. However, the police never found out who this mark belonged to. 2. Farm Massacre. At the end of March 1922, a terrible thing happened on a snowy farm in Germany. Someone beat the entire Hinterkaifeck family, mother, father, and their 3 children to death with a hoe. The maid was also killed. Almost a century has passed since then, but no one has yet been arrested on charges of this brutal crime. The carelessness of the victims adds to the horror. A few days before the terrible events, a bunch of keys from the house disappeared and footprints were found in the snow leading towards the farm. It is assumed that the killer was hiding in the attic, where one by one he lured all the family members. Most likely, he lived in the house for several days after that, feeding the livestock and heating the chimney. Top 3. Bennett Home Invasion. On January 16, 1984, in Colorado, USA, at night, 27-year-old Bruce Bennett discovered that someone had broken into his house. The man got into a fight with the intruder, but lost. He was beaten with a blunt object, most likely a hammer, and then his throat was cut. After this, the killer looked into the bedroom of Mrs. Bennett, 26 years old, raped and killed her and 7-year-old Melissa. The villain did not stop there. He attacked 3-year-old Vanessa, whom he left to die with a severe facial injury. Miraculously, the child managed to survive. It is believed that earlier in the same month, the same maniac carried out several more attacks in the area, as a result of which another young woman, Patricia Louise, died from her injuries. 4. Murders in Cheshire. A terrible story that happened not so long ago. On a summer night in Connecticut in 2007, Jennifer Hawk Pettit and her 11-year-old daughter Michaela were accosted by a couple of deranged boys in a grocery store. The hooligans followed the woman and broke into her house. The bandits attacked the head of the family, tied him up and threw him in the basement. They then doused the house with gasoline, raped young Michaela in her crib, strangled her mother, and set the house on fire before fleeing. The man managed to survive, and the criminals were eventually arrested. 5. Attack on the Orchard Park Apartments. On July 27, 1979, the headless body of 33-year-old Alice Elaine Rankin was discovered in an apartment outside Houston. The body was found by a murdered colleague. The woman herself was tied up and raped, but her head was never found. Just a couple of weeks later, on August 10th, another attack took place in the same apartment building. 2 floors above, Mary Michael Calcutta was beaten, raped, and stabbed to death. The killer, or killers if such coincidences are possible, were never found. 6. Railroad Axe Murders. This case is believed to be the first recorded case of murder as a result of a home invasion in police reports. A madman armed with an axe killed a mother and her 3 children. Next, the maniac followed the railroad on the southern coast of the United States, invading other houses and killing their inhabitants. In total, the psychopath was responsible for 6 invasions and 49 axe murders between January 1911 and April 1912. Moreover, the killer attacked mixed families, which makes one think about motives related to the racial issue. The worst thing is that the culprit was never found. despite the fact that he did his bloody work for 14 months. 7. Murder of the Setayaga family. Another unsolved case. It happened in Tokyo in 2000, or rather on New Year's holidays. The killer, armed with a knife, entered Setayaga's house through a window on the second floor. The first victim was 6-year-old Ryu, who was strangled by the attacker in his own bed. Horror cinema has a special subgenre, or more precisely, a special theme: home invasion. That is, films about how some villains enter a private home and turn the life of its owners into a waking nightmare. The first, The Purge, The French Them, and Inside, The Hollywood Panic Room, Strangers, You're Ended, or the very fresh Don't Breathe. The plots of all these films play on the same motive, touch on the same Philistine fear, constantly reminding you and me that even within our own walls, no one can feel completely safe. And unlike numerous horror films about vengeful ghosts or blood-sucking ghouls, home invasion films frighten primarily with their realism, because this can happen and has happened more than once in reality. 8. Richard Speck and the Massacre of Nurses. This year marks half a century since this horrific incident. Madden psycho Richard Speck entered the dormitory of a medical college in Chicago in the middle of the night and systematically massacred 8 nurses. Speck was armed with a pistol and a knife. He woke up the girls one by one, tied them up, then strangled and tortured each one. The frightened sisters did not resist even though they saw what the psychopath was doing to their girlfriends. Only one girl managed to survive. She was smart enough to hide under the bed. 9. Murder of the Clutter family. This happened in 1959 in Kansas. The famous writer Truman Capote later wrote a semi-documentary book about this case, and in 1967, director Richard Brooks filmed this work with the film In Cold Blood. This is the story of how 2 homeless people, Perry Smith and Dick Hickok, tried to rob the Clutter family, but unable to find anything to profit from in their house, they brutally murdered Herbert Clutter, his wife Bonnie, and their 2 children, 15-year-old Kenyon and 16-year-old Nancy. 6 weeks later, the killers were caught and eventually sentenced to death and executed by hanging. 10. The Manson family murders. The most resonant case of this kind. In 1969, members of the Charles Manson sect, following the instructions of their leader, broke into the home of actress Sharon Tate, wife of film director Roman Polanski. Pregnant Sharon was killed by inflicting multiple wounds with a knife and strangling with a rope, and the inscription in blood "Pig" was left on the door of the house. The next night, cultists attacked another house, killing its owners and leaving bloody signs reading "Helter Skelter" and "Death to Pigs." As you probably know, the case was solved and Manson was convicted and is still serving his sentence in prison. It started on TV around midnight from Friday to Saturday. I still remember that intelligible expression on the child's face, which did not leave the slightest doubt in my heart. Perhaps, until recently, I was a skeptic. Unfamiliar with the intricacies of rural life, I questioned all superstitions that did not correspond to my empirical experience. Which scientist could seriously imagine that something transcendental, alien to our fundamental ideas about nature, could live hand in hand with each of us? And what power is responsible for this? But first things first. The Foundation is looking for employees. Read the announcement on the tattered pole, next to the announcement of the missing animal. Our friend Marshik is missing. Read the inscription above the image of the thick striped muzzle of a capybara. The image of the building of the mysterious Foundation looked incomparably more boring and touched me much less than the fate of the poor mincemeat. The evening turned out to be warm like summer, tart like wine. I stood at the pillar, enjoying the cool Stella. The aroma in the air confused my thoughts. The imagination was intoxicating. It's like a bottle of Cabernet was poured into my hood. Suddenly, something tugged at my sleeve, and I realized that the mysterious aroma had really turned my head. The bottle of beer almost fell out of my hands, and some of the foamy contents spilled onto the path. Shaking my head and taking a sip from the bottle, I turned to the source of my anxiety. It was the neighbor's boy, Timofey. "Turn off my TV," he almost whispered, continuing to tug at my sleeve and pointing his finger into the blackness of the open entrance. In the light of the lamp on the canopy of the entrance, he looked like a grimy little animal. His hair looked like strands of greasy black straw, crushed in several places. From under the bangs, rounded eyes full of childish horror looked at me. Having unhooked the boy from the sleeve of his bomber jacket and inquired about what had happened, I listened carefully to his confused story. Perhaps a small remark needs to be made here. Timofey was my neighbor and sometimes came to visit and play with the curling iron. He lived with his mother, who taught at some university. His mother was a cultured, sympathetic woman and did not object to our gatherings for GOW 4 and MK11. Timofey was a smart and cheerful guy. I kept track of the time, leaving for my home strictly for dinner, and always with an unwashed head, and I couldn't wean him off. At first, it irritated me a little, but later I got used to it. "It doesn't turn off! Doesn't turn off!" Timothy continued. From fear, his eyes shone with a greasy shine, like his hair. The slur of his speech, coupled with the heady smell of the night, gave me a slight headache. It was as if the universe itself was intoxicated. From the boy's words, it followed that some kind of woman had taken up residence on his TV, and this old man dragged his mother away. These words simply shocked me. Knowing Timofey, I could not even think that he was capable of doing something like that. The flow of such absurd, creepy information made me want to smoke, but having taken out the pack, I immediately put it back in my pocket and drank the remaining beer in one gulp, and we entered the entrance. Now it's no secret that their appearance is sometimes signaled by various odors. It often smells strongly of ozone, ink, rot, and even hot cake. And in the darkness of the entrance, there was a disgusting but familiar smell to me. Later, I recognized the mousy tone in it. You know, like spoiled wine, and I would prefer never to inhale it again. Timofey froze in indecision. His small, shaking hand slowly reached for the doorknob. I think the boy would gladly give me the right to open the door for him, but he didn't want to look like a scared child. When he finally pressed the handle, the apartment smelled of that same sickening smell of sick wine. "Valeria, you are at home?" I shouted, pulling the guy behind my back. Nobody answered. There was a black BMX lying in the aisle. The closet with things is wide open. Things are on the floor. We carefully moved through the apartment. Fortunately, the lights were on in all rooms. When we entered Timofey's room, the guy lightly tugged at my jacket. "Look," he whispered, nodding towards the socket. His room was about 7 meters long. There was a sofa against the right wall with a black and white poster above it. The poster depicted the faces of famous American rappers, among whom only Eminem was white. The TV was located almost by the window, next to the computer desk, and he worked, contrary to common sense. A black cord snaked across the floor, torn from a rickety Euro socket. I looked behind the TV from all sides and ended up staring blankly at the image on the screen. When we first crossed the threshold, the black and white image on the screen was static. But now, it seemed to come to life, fueled by our presence. What I first took to be a lamppost suddenly began to move. The top of the pillar shook, emitting various signals. It buzzed louder and louder, from a sickeningly loud alarm to the intermittent ambulance siren. Continuing to imitate a siren, the pillar moved and walked along the path on 2 thin legs. And through the cacophony of the sounds described above, another one was heard, the sound of grinding limbs. According to rough estimates, the height of the creature was about 15 meters because the top of the pillar almost touched the roofs of the 5-story buildings. Captivated by the strange phenomenon, I completely lost sight of Timofey. He stood slightly behind me, looking like textbook death. Realizing that the guy was about to collapse, I hurried to take him out of the apartment, dialing 112 as I went. "They don't answer?" Timothy asked when I cursed and hid the phone in my pocket. Nobody answered the phone. "Listen, Tion, go down the stairs. This stench is becoming unbearable. I'll go to the neighbors and then immediately come down to you," I said, and the guy strictly followed my order, descending into the blackness, and I never saw him again. The fact is that Timofey lived on the 7th floor above me, and I curse myself for that day. You couldn't let him go down the stairs, you couldn't. For while I, covering my face with my hand, unsuccessfully rammed into the neighbors' apartments, the guy seemed to have disappeared. I heard him walk up a couple of flights of stairs and stop mid-step. It was as if someone had stolen him from our world, catching him on the steps. Having gone downstairs and not finding Tyoma there, I immediately rushed back to the entrance. Scraps of chaotic thoughts flashed through my head. Pieces of consciousness swarmed before my eyes like huge blue-black flies, and I had to try to bring myself back to normal. But I swear, at that moment my heightened intuition did not allow me to step onto the destructive steps into the primordial darkness, which still haunts me. I rode the elevator around each floor, shouting the boy's name. The answer was silence. No, there was something else. The invisible but fierce breath of the underworld itself. I vaguely remember how I got out of that hell. Waking up in the still wine-soaked air, I ran away from the damn place. He ran until he was exhausted, for I remembered that the TV was broadcasting the road leading directly to my yard. A colossally huge creature, whose head was replaced by 3 horns, was very close. He is about to find himself in the yard, simply by stepping through the old gate. Leaving the house far behind, I stopped to rest and collect my thoughts, looking for at least some rational explanation for what had happened. And finally, he lit a cigarette. The men and I secretly thought about the nature of these phenomena. There were an abundance of hypotheses, parallel worlds and an error in the structure of the universe, God's judgment and aliens, order out of chaos and vice versa. My hypothesis is that there was a certain layering of realities alien to each other, something like a collage of parallel worlds, but it's all to no avail. What good is this knowledge if we have never heard emergency sirens, till today? We also had no idea whether these creatures or phenomena had intelligence. Maybe this has already happened hundreds or even millions of years ago. Perhaps the behavior of these creatures is determined by the same laws by which the sun rises and sets. But we still understood one rule: it's safer together. The objects, as we eventually called them, for reasons only known to God, rarely noticed groups of people but immediately grabbed individuals. But gathering into groups, as we have now seen, did not guarantee salvation, but only delayed death. Now, there are 7 of us. The first people I met were the Nureyev family. The head of the family, whose name was Fedor, was the owner of some establishment. It was he who told me about the dangers that await loners. He and his family came face to face with some huge, stooped monster. Fortunately, according to Fedya, he and his wife managed to close their eyes and close their son's eyes as soon as the creature stretched its terrible, rubber-like mouth. He and his wife were convinced that the creature, like monkeys, did not tolerate eye contact. Later, the 4 of us met 2 girls, 16 and 5 years old, Lyra and Oksana, sisters. The eldest, Oksana, told us about the sculptures. According to her, several concrete sculptures in the form of a family of strange tadpoles appeared on the road. What resembled faces were dark smears of black, red, and green paint. Oksana is convinced that they were saved by Lyra, who foresaw that the sculptures would require them to make eye contact. The girl walked 30 meters without blinking and without taking her eyes off the ominous sculptures, and she told us in great detail how the sculptures surrounded some guy who was screaming. Oksana heard, but did not see, too scared to turn around. Another strange thing was noticed about Lyra. She was afraid of cats and black clothes, and also fell into a panic at the sight of a children's coloring book. Some of us had to change into light clothes, and Micah looks to be in his 30s, previously worked in a morgue. Without being an exception, he also told us about the devilry that happened to him. A coffin appeared in the morgue, but this coffin seemed to be something beyond our understanding. It's like being plucked from another dimension. Misha left the morgue before sharing the fate of most of his colleagues. No, not them. The creatures came out of the morgue. Their faces turned into monstrous ones, causing at the same time deep confusion and grimace of animal horror. Faces stretched out in all directions looked at me, with eyes blurred from the bridge of the nose to the temples. The mouths twisted into insanely bloodthirsty grins. God forbid you meet those monsters. I see them in my dreams, these vile bodies deformed into forms inaccessible to my understanding. Literally. Svetlana, Fyodor's wife, also told us the story of her best friend. Inna, a friend, came home and saw something inexplicable. A gelatinous mass was crawling into the apartment through the balcony. While Inna was in a daze, the mass managed to fill half the room. The tip of the gelatinous tongue rose up, and on the other side of it the girl saw endless depth, as if there was an entire ocean inside the creature. And she looked into this abyss until she fainted. She doesn't remember how she was saved. But from now on, he is terribly afraid of water. At first, she was with the Nureyevs, but said goodbye to them on Tuesday, going in search of her relatives. If I weren't an orphan, would I be able to come to terms with the loss of my loved ones? When I spoke about delaying death, I meant the creature under the door of our shelter. I saw her through the peephole, an unimaginably terrible creature, alien to our understanding, had such familiar, unwashed black hair and eyes covered with a greasy sheen. Max and Fyodor still believe that sirens sounding somewhere nearby signify an imminent rescue and victory over the objects. Perhaps the police and army really are taking control of the situation and will soon get us out of here. But is a person able to cope with such a creature? I would like to believe in a good outcome if I had not seen that creature on Timothy's TV. I hope the men are right and we really won. Otherwise, my diary risks becoming an epitaph for all of us. It happened in the middle of the night. I was in the bedroom trying to rest. I changed the channel on the TV and saw that the local news was now on. Alarming news appeared at the bottom of the screen. A killer is on the loose, hidden in the surrounding area. Police urge everyone to be on alert. The suspect is armed and dangerous. I was about to go to bed when I suddenly heard a strange noise downstairs. It seemed like there was someone in the house. I began to sweat and my heart began to race. Straining my ears, hoping to hear something, I heard the door creak. It wasn't my imagination. There was an uninvited guest in the house. I have to get out of here, quickly, I thought. I climbed out of bed as quietly as possible and crept to the window. My body was shaking with fear and I really hoped that I wouldn't make a sound. At this time, I heard faint footsteps coming up the stairs. It sounded like there was more than one person there. They could burst into the room at any second. I needed to leave. I climbed out the window onto the roof of the garage, moving as fast as I could without making too much noise. At the edge of the roof, I grabbed the drain pipe and lowered myself until I landed in the garden. When I caught my breath, I looked at the window where I had just escaped and saw the light turn on. That was very close, I thought. A chill ran down my spine as I thought about what would have happened if I had been captured. I headed into the forest. When I was safely hidden behind the trees, I ran. I ran forward, stumbling in the darkness, moving through the underbrush until I reached another apartment complex. Clutching my knife, I headed towards the house.